Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today, what we want to talk about is urbanization, and we've talked a little bit about this already. We've talked about urban sprawl and suburbs and things like that. But I really want to focus on the environmental issues and some of the things that we haven't talked about when we are talking about the expansion of cities. And the first thing we're going to start off with is a question. And the question is, why are cities often much more polluted than the neighboring countryside? And here are your choices. There are more factories in the city. Cities tend to heat up more than the countryside, resulting in air inversions and the trapping of air pollution. Because of taller buildings, there tends to be less wind in the cities than in the countryside. There's generally a higher density of cars being driven in cities, or all of the above. This one is probably obvious. It is definitely all of the above. And these are the things that we're going to talk about and some other things as well. Okay, so when we talk about urbanization, people move to cities because of push factors that force them out of rural areas and pull factors that bring them to the city that give them hope to find jobs or a better life or whatever. And so some of the push factors can range from simply not being able to farm, not being able to make any money if they live in agricultural areas, or they can be as extreme as being refugees of some sort, either from some sort of conflict or environmental refugees. Wherever they live is so degraded that you can no longer make a living either in terms of food or money off of that area. Pull factors include things like jobs, right? Homes, schools, so education, healthcare, right? Any of those things like hospitals, stuff like that. So what that means is that the urban populations are growing, and they are growing so fast. And because they're growing so fast and they're not keeping up with growth, you have a couple of issues. One, you have the urban sprawl issue, which we've talked about before. But then in developing countries, what you end up having are lots of people flooding these cities, and they come so fast that they outpace the growth in infrastructure. There are not enough jobs. The city or state or country can't support the urbanites, right? These people who are coming. And so you have these massive centers of poverty. This is not as true in developed countries, but in developing countries, there's a massive increase in poverty in these cities. And when you look at this map, you can see that lots and lots of the world's mega cities, and a mega city is a population over 10 million, okay? These mega cities are actually in developing nations, and so you get these massive cities, very little suburbia, right? But it turns out that by 2004, over half of the world's population lived in urban areas, and that's projected to be about 70% by 2050, actually, and we're pretty much on track for that, okay? In the United States, though, 8 out of 10, 80% of Americans actually live in urban areas, and we have 44, and that's actually true across the board for all developed countries. We're a little bit higher, but it's true across the globe. And you can see, look at these giant cities. I mean, there's us right there. We're huge, right? And in terms of land space, we're actually larger than some of the other. I mean, look at Chicago's up here. It's tiny. Minneapolis. I mean, we're big, right? Houston's big. Okay, all of these places. And then on the coast, you have these cities that just run forever. It's just, they're individual cities, but you see no break. I mean, there's a big break between Dallas and Houston. You can see this network of towns and stuff. But look at this. It's all solid urbanization here and then pretty much over here too. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay. Now, urban sprawl we've talked about, but I just want to remind you, urban sprawl occurs when you have available land that is affordable, cheap, right? And so you get this outward sprawl because, first of all, there are government loans that will actually guarantee people money to buy houses in suburbs, and that's been going on since World War II, or since after World War II. Gasoline, right? The fact that we don't, especially in the South, gasoline is a lot cheaper here than it is in other places, and so we have government-funded highways, we have fairly cheap gasoline comparatively, and so that's going to encourage a lot of automobile use. If you have a car, most people feel comfortable living in suburbs. You get exemptions from various taxes if you own your home, and that's a really nice thing too. There's called the homestead exemption. And then zoning laws actually separate residential and commercial use of land, and we saw that in the video that we watched. And so what that means is that you can only build houses in places, and you can only build commercial stuff like grocery stores and other kinds of things. And so you don't get that nice combination that you would need to have that smart growth that you have in the cities. And also, there's just no planning. I mean, cities just grow faster than people can keep up with, and so nobody's really thought it through. And here's Las Vegas. This is actually between 1973 and 2000. That is astounding. And this is a desert. And the one thing that I really want to call your attention to is all of this green. In a desert, you should not see this much green, and this is part of that huge push and pressure on water, and part of the water war between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. It's because everybody wants to have green lawns, and they're just not accepting the fact that they live in a desert. Okay, now, when you get this sprawl, you get these urban areas merging, and they form megalopolises, and that's a fun word to say. But Boston, that Boston to Washington, D.C. corridor that includes Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore, this is actually sometimes referred to as BOWASH, and it's almost considered to be one city, even though you're talking about multiple states that you're spanning. It's all just back-to-back urbanization, and we saw that on the other United States at Night map. Okay, so urban resource and environmental problems. First of all, you do have some advantages, right? There are more job opportunities. You can have better education and health services, and we've talked about why those three things are all really important. But you can also help protect biodiversity in wild spaces by concentrating people instead of letting them sprawl out. And so smart growth and restricted growth can actually help biodiversity. Now, the disadvantages are cities are rarely self-sustaining. They don't grow any food. They don't do anything. They can threaten biodiversity, especially if you have sprawl, but pollution threatens biodiversity. The resources necessary to build cities and to expand cities threatens biodiversity. They also typically have a lack of green spaces, so there's a lack of trees. So instead of having trees to absorb, say, CO2 in the atmosphere, we don't have as many trees. We cut them down. There's the concentration of pollutants in the city, there's noise, there's light pollution. Infectious diseases can spread, especially in developing nations where they don't have good sanitation and where people are packed right on top of each other. And you get these centers of poverty, crime, and terrorism. There should probably be commas in between poverty, crime, and so just pretend they're there. But anyway, you have these centers of poverty. Where there's poverty, there's crime. And in some of the developing nations, you have seen a rise in terrorism. Okay, now, natural capital degradation caused by urban sprawl. This is a very nice little table here. You need to know many of these, okay? And so here we've got the land and biodiversity land. We've talked about all these, this loss of habitat. Be specific about what's happening. The other thing that I wanted to mention is wildlife roadkill. Roads kill animals. Cars hit them. And so that is a problem that we haven't talked about and that we haven't really thought about, but know that that's an issue too. Human health and just aesthetics. We make the area ugly, right? We contaminate our air, we contaminate our water. Stress is caused by noise pollution and light pollution and traffic and, all of these things. And then we have actual health issues here. And then also the sedentary lifestyle that lots of people going from car to office to car to home to car to office to car to home causes some weight issues in many people. Now, increased runoff because of the pavement, we know some of these. Energy, air, and climate, right? We've talked about these two. We're about to talk about the heat island effect, so we're going to come back to that. And then economic effects. You've got higher taxes, you've got urban decay, increased unemployment in the downtown areas, and then you have the loss of tax bases in the central city, which is why the taxes are getting higher there. So you have this really vicious cycle. Okay, now when we talk about resources, right, you have energy, food, water, raw materials, manufactured good, money, information, all the things that are going to come out of these. Some things are good, ideas, wealth, manufactured goods, those are all goods. Noise, those are all good things. Noise, not so good. Water pollutants, greenhouse gases, air pollutants, waste heat, and solid waste, those are all not good. And so it's a high input system because they're not sustainable. and it's a high output system, most of which is going to be environmentally negative, right? Having a negative environmental impact. Okay, so when we talk about noise and light, I just want to briefly talk about those really quickly. It's odd to think about sound as being a problem, but here are some of the decibels, right? The decibel levels, and decibels what we measure sound in. And so you can see these are a lot of things we're exposed to: lawnmowers, chainsaws, music, rock music, all sorts of stuff, cars, right, that have really loud music, earphones that we like to listen to, vacuum cleaners, people talking all the time, right? And permanent damage starts right here. If you're exposed 8 hours, and if you think about the world around you, we have noise constantly. So just keep this in mind. This causes not only damage to your hearing, but it causes stress. And stress manifests itself physically and can be a huge problem. Okay? All right, now, poverty. When we have lots of people living in places where they can't get jobs and there's not enough housing, you end up having slums and shanty towns. And here's a really good example of one of those. You don't have adequate water supplies, you don't have good sewage disposal, and there's not other services. And a lot of times these are illegal, and so there's a lot of crime. There are a lot of issues with that too. Okay, slums and shanty towns. Now, transportation is a huge issue too. We rely on cars very heavily in the United States, and in some places there's really good mass transit, but in other places there's not great mass transit. But if we could get better mass transit systems, we could decrease our dependence on oil significantly, right? And so we could also limit the amount of roads we needed to build, so we could limit the increase in runoff. We could limit the air pollution because we're taking cars off the roads and things like that. So the automobile is a huge, huge deal, right? And mass transit is very helpful for that. Cars are great because you can go anywhere. They give you a certain amount of freedom. They promote economic growth because you have to build the cars, you have to service the cars, you have to have gasoline, you have to process the oil into gasoline, all of these things. Oh, and they allow people to get to jobs. So all of these things either create jobs or allow people to get to jobs. But car accidents take a huge toll on resources in terms of accidents, deaths, injuries, just general property destruction. There is the huge polluting, right? They are the fundamental root of urban sprawl, because if you have a car, you can go anywhere. And traffic jams, that is stressful and pollution filled, right? And so all kinds of problems with cars. Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about how the city itself actually changes the climate, right? And what we're talking about is the heat island effect. And what you're going to be doing is designing a lab to figure out how you could mitigate the effects of all of this pavement and stuff. And what you're looking at here is a nice little photo. And then what you're seeing is, look at all this pavement, how hot it is, right? Red is hot, bluer is colder. This is gravel. It's got plants and all this good stuff. But that pavement, whether it's asphalt or concrete, they both get really, really hot. And so what happens is you have a lot of pavement in cities. You generally have 2 to 4 degrees difference between cities and rural areas. And so, and suburbs too get a little hot because they've got a little pavement too. And so you have this nice little graph. You've got your rural, commercial goes up, cities way up. Then you have a little blip a little bit higher here that is suburbs. And so you have a big difference, and it mostly occurs during the summer, and it can be really pronounced in the summer, but it actually happens all year round, especially in the south where it's warm a good portion of the time. And so you have this air rising, this low pressure system, and it stops wind in addition to these buildings being stopped. It changes, it doesn't allow for rain, and so in some places you have actually less rain. One of the benefits, though, is that it actually does break up big storms, so it's harder for tornadoes to form in the city area, but I don't know if that's a good enough benefit to make it a good idea. So here's just another example, right? Here you have your high temperatures, okay, and here's desert's hot. But look, city's not a whole lot less, in terms of heat. And then when you're talking about your coldest temperatures, there's not a whole lot of difference here in when you're talking about the city, okay? Again, mostly during the summer. And here's just an example. This is Evan from Channel 4. He's one of my favorite weather people. But you can see here's Dallas at 40, right? Wow. Fort Worth at 38. But then look at the surrounding areas. Okay, Ennis. This is not actually this was not this was not a correct temperature reading. But as far as I know, it may have been actually. But you can see the difference. Look at that 35, 32, 33, 34, 37. 35, and so you can see the difference there. All right, so why are cities so hot? Asphalt, concrete, roofs, those are the big ones. Asphalt, it absorbs radiation. Concrete, it reflects it. And dark roofs absorb it. Okay, the problem is green spaces. We need more trees. They shade buildings, they block radiation, and they cool through evapotranspiration. And so the more green spaces that you can have, the better you will be. And you can see hot, 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 hot. Just add some more trees, some more vegetation, and that will lower that considerably. Okay, so what's the impact? You have increased energy use from air conditioning and driving, because you don't want to walk when it's hot. Most people would rather drive. This is going to contribute to air quality, which is our next unit. It's going to contribute to global climate change. You have decreased air quality, smog, right, because of all of this driving, because of this temperature inversion that locks your pollutants in. That's going to have a public health issue, an effect on public health issues. So you're going to have heat exhaustion, heat stroke, because it's hotter in the summers. You're going to have respiratory issues because of ground level ozone that's created by this toxic mix that's in the atmosphere. And we'll talk about how ozone is actually made in the next unit. And then water issues. People want green lawns. They're going to water them. They want nice landscaping. They're going to water that. People like pools and fountains and decorative water things. Well, water evaporates from that, okay? And so there's a huge water use issue that goes on with all of this urbanization. So what can be done? We've already talked about green spaces. Parks and green roofs are big, 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 right? And so you can see this is a really nice green roof they have going on here. And an interesting thing about green roof is it doesn't just help the local climate, right? They're carbon sinks, which is great for global climate change. That's good. But also, companies that have put parks or green roofs in or around their buildings, on or around their buildings, have actually noticed an increase in productivity. People can get out, they can relax, they can take a lunch break there, out in this little parky area, and it just helps people relax and then focus when they come back in. And so there's all kinds of reasons to have green spaces. Passive cooling, right? Build your buildings so they don't need to have so much air conditioning. Geothermal heat pumps, we've talked about that before. That's where you put your pipes underneath the ground where it's all that same temperature. And then also you need to make sure that you're taking care of those people who are at the highest risk for health issues like heat stroke or respiratory issues. That's typically going to be your children, your elderly, and your infirm. And so we need to make sure that we keep an eye on them. Okay, this is just your question again. But anyway, so that brings us to the end of this conversation about urbanization. If you have any questions, please ask me at the beginning of class, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.